Today, we're peeking behind the curtain of church consulting on the Church Revitalization Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast, brought to you by the Malphurs Group team, where each week we tackle important, actionable topics to help churches thrive. And now, here's your hosts, Scott Ball and AJ Matthew.
Welcome to the Church Revitalization Podcast. My name is Scott Ball. I'm joined by my friend and co-host AJ Matthew. And today we're talking about church consulting, which is something that AJ and I know a thing or two about, seeing as it's the work that we do. Although I feel like on the front end we should say that's not a term that we prefer. I think church consulting is a term that has a lot of baggage with it. So internally, when we talk with churches, we generally don't use that term. We're going to use it throughout today's episode just for accessibility for those of you who are listening. But just know that it's not our preferred term. Why don't we just start there for a second, AJ, and kind of explain what's some of the baggage with the term church consulting. I think maybe some of our listeners might even have clicked on this episode and gone, well, here I'm going to get some ammunition for why I don't like church consulting. So why does church consulting have so much baggage?
Well, yeah, I think the term consultant is just very businessy, in which there's a variety of even processes and ideas in the church space that is, to some extent shuns business things. And so this term consultant certainly comes out of the business world, and it just doesn't sound appealing to a lot of people. They don't see that there would be a connection between anything having to do with the church and consulting. So, I mean, that's really only one of the reasons that we actually just internally refer to ourselves as guides. But more so that even the hard definition of consultant versus guide more so encapsulates really the work that we're actually doing in guiding a church, through a process and seeking, an improvement in church health and functionality and discipleship and everything that goes along with it. So, we call ourselves guides, and we think that's a better fit for the actual work than a consultant, which people would probably associate with a person, an expert coming in and telling you what you should do.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, AJ. I think that we it's also a differentiation in terms of our approach, right? So we have there are folks out there in the church consulting space who do see their job as, hey, I'm going to run some assessments, then I'm going to give you a list of recommendations. And that is really similar to what you see in the business world as it relates to consulting. Mm-hmm. That is not how we operate. It's not what we do. What we do is guide people through a process and really empower the church with the tools that they need and with the processes that they need to develop their strategies and a vision for the future. So we don't take a typical approach to consulting or a classical approach to consulting. It really is a collaboration, and so we use the term guide. So all that to say, the term consulting has a lot of baggage. We're going to be using it quite a bit throughout today's episode, or the term church consultant throughout today's episode, just for accessibility. But I thought it would be good to give that disclaimer. Also, AJ, before we dive into, we've got 5 sort of realities about church consulting, or 5 secrets of a church consultant that we want to share with you today. Before we do that, one of the driving one of the main reasons that we wanted to do this episode is we wanted to share an opportunity for some of our potential listeners or some of our audience. AJ, do you want to hit the high note of that, and then we'll dive into our points?
Yeah, long story short, we are finally, after really a long development phase, launching a certified guide process. We have had lots of people inquire about this over the years, and we've always wanted to do it. And we sort of began the process even a year ago as we expanded our team. And so this fall, yes, we're excited that we're going to now be able to certify people as Malphurs Group guides in our strategic envisioning process. And more on that at the end of the show.
Right. So All that being said, if you're like, is this something that I should do? Is this something that I have a call from the Lord to do? We thought it might be good to peel back the curtain a little bit and share some secrets of a church consultant. And even if that's not you, you're not interested in this, these are good things for you to learn so that you know if you ever do work with a church consultant, how you can make help you find a good consultant and also make sure your consulting experience is better. So with that, let's dive into number one, AJ.
Yeah, I think actually what our setup is actually a really good segue into this. And the first point is that as a church consultant, you need to be able to think strategically, but act relationally. And I think that's what we're even talking about in the difference between consulting and being a guide. It really has to become, to some extent, a blend of the two, where you're able to identify problems, understand problems that are presented to you, think through a variety of solutions, what might be the best solution, be able to have those kinds of discussions, in our case, work through processes, but still at the end of the day, we're talking about ministry, and building relationships with people is key. Understanding the emotions behind, hurts that have happened in churches, and past histories that have happened, the different types of leaders that they've experienced over the years. Churches, for the most part, are long-standing institutions. Every now and then we work with a newer church. Maybe it was planted less than 10 years ago. But for the most part, we're talking about decades-old institutions. And sometimes the people in them have been there that long. And so it's really, really important to understand, long histories and relationships, and be able to relate at a level that you can build that trust to be able to work through effective solutions for them.
Oh man, yeah. If you think for 1 second that you're going to be able to hop into any church and that just by sheer force of will or the attraction of such a great idea that you have, that this church is going to change, you are fooling yourself. That they did not get where they are in terms of decline or unhealth, if that's the situation in the church, overnight, and they're not going to get out of it overnight. And since that's the reality, it's going to hinge on how good of a relationship you have with them and how much trust there is between you and the church. If they don't trust you, it doesn't matter how good your idea is. And so when I start a conversation with a church, just full disclosure, the very first discovery meeting that I have, if you're a pastor and we meet, I care way more about trying to build a connection with you, a genuine one, not a fake one, a real connection with you, a relationship with you, then I care about explaining how does strategic envisioning work. This is a mistake that I made, I think, early on in my consulting ministry, was thinking I've got to sell this church on our process, in this first meeting. And really, that's not it. I need to show why I'm trustworthy as a person. That's the most important thing I need to do. And not just create the appearance of trustworthiness, but actually be trustworthy. Do you know what I mean, AJ? I'm not trying to fool anybody. Like I want to be a trustworthy person, and I want to be able to create that connection.
Yeah, well, that's right. After all, at the end of the day, we're doing this because we have heart for this ministry. We want churches to do better than they are today. We want God's kingdom to grow, and there's a huge need for that. And so if we can't, build that relationship and build that trust so that we can work together on making the improvements that you want for your church and we want for you, then there's an awful lot of wasted time and money. And so, yes, from the very beginning, our heart is for success. And
that's right.
You just can't have that by, throwing somebody an outline of to-dos.
That's right.
It's got to be, it has to be a team approach, and an effective team is one that trusts each other, understands each other, and works together for a common goal.
Before we move on to the second point, I do want to mention, it's worth noting, I think, that it is important that you have some track record of success. in some area that would help them. So I'm just going to be blunt, AJ. There are a lot of guys who want to get into consulting, who have been pastors for decades, and their own churches have declined, plateaued, whatever, and they were never able to recover from that. And it can't be a blind leading the blind type situation. Do you need to have done a revitalization process before? Not necessarily. For example, I'll just use myself as an example, AJ. I've never served as the lead pastor. I've always been a second cheerleader, or served in some other capacity. But I have directly led multiple ministries that have grown. So I don't see the need for. It's not necessarily that you have to have been a revitalization pastor and led a church through revitalization, but have you led ministries that actually grew as a result of the things that you were doing? That doesn't mean you can't have mistakes in ministry or failures in ministry. I have those too. But part of building that trust is the thought that the things you're bringing to the table may actually work. And that's part of that thinking strategically component.
Yeah, right on. Let's keep moving. Our next point is that you can't be the expert on everything, but you need to be able to find answers. There's a lot of people in a lot of consulting capacities around the world that are able to get a lot done because they know how to use the right search terms in Google. Right, Scott?
Yeah. Sometimes
the answer that you seek is because of your ability to formulate a question to find the right information. And that translates into this as well. I'm not saying that, you're turning aside and Googling on your phone whenever somebody in a meeting asks you a question, but you've got to be able to at least pull back, go back into your mind, think through other scenarios in which you've operated and be able to answer things that way. Or, say, I'm not really sure on that. That's a great question. And I'm going to help you find out what the answer, is to that, or what the best way to handle that would be. And that's okay. I think going back even to our previous point, that is a relationship building moment. Whenever you can be transparent and honest, but seek to find answers for somebody, then, that actually has the ability to increase trust in a relationship. Because if you're faking it, somebody's going to know it. And totally. And you've got to be vulnerable when you need to be vulnerable, but and you need to be an expert when it's time to be an expert. But that relationship blend is what happens in there, and having that ability is key. And understanding that about yourself, whether you have that ability or not, is important.
So true. This is something that I think that has changed a lot for me over the years that I've been doing this. I used to feel like I needed to have the answer to everything, and I've realized I don't. I just need to be able to help find an answer. So it actually, going back to trust, it reduces trust if I give bad advice or try to claim to be an expert in something that I actually have no business claiming to be an expert in. And so, being able to say, I don't know, or let me think about that, or let me find you a good resource is an okay thing. And it's important that we, if you do turn someone on to a good resource, that does not diminish you as an expert in their mind, because the next time they have a question, they need something, they'll feel comfortable coming back to you, knowing that you'll either have an answer or be able to connect them with one. That's the key. So don't try to be an expert in something that you're not.
Yeah, that's right. Sometimes it's the ability to simply process through a situation and consider what the possible outcomes are. So, whatever it might be, hey, AJ, or hey, Scott, what should we do about this? If there's not like a clear singular answer that you just know because you're an expert, then it could be, I don't know, let's walk through what the possibilities might be. If we were to go this way, let's consider these questions that would need to be answered, or how might this outcome look? On the other hand, if we did this, here's how that might look. And it could be more of a collaborative approach in which in the end, a clear direction becomes apparent to all parties involved because you had the ability to lead a conversation through the right set of scenarios to determine what's best in that situation. That is also a key ability that you have to be able to tap into sometimes on the fly. Don't you think, Scott?
Totally. Yeah. If you can't kind of work on the fly, well, that probably could have been its own point, but yeah, the ability to think on your feet, but don't just make stuff up. Like, it's okay to say, I don't know. Or let me look into that, or let's put a pin in that one, and then we'll come back to it. Yeah. Those are all better than you just making something up. That's terrible advice.
So I guess let's do a quick little side point, an additional bonus point, since we did kind of open this up on just being able to respond to things that you may not have been prepared for. We have both been in some really interesting situations. Sometimes on the back end, they turn out to be humorous even. But yeah, if you don't have the ability to be put on the spot and not begin shaking and sweating, this might not be the job for you, because we've certainly been there. I've walked into situations in which I thought was going to be maybe meeting with a leadership team, turned out to be the entire congregation. And so, that if you don't have the ability to pivot at that point and go, oh, okay, they just, are about to hand me a microphone and I'm going to start talking to a group of people that I was not ready for. Or, and even the first time I experienced this, Scott, one of my very first times out, I was working directly with Aubrey. He and I went to Virginia together, and this is just a silly thing, but he left on like Saturday and wanted me to stay over Sunday and work on a few more things. And I went to church there, and they're closing the service out, and the pastor called me out from just sitting in the pews with everybody else to like close out, their Sunday morning worship service with a word and a prayer. And I was like, literally been a quote unquote consultant for like a month. And I was like, wow, here we go, stand up in this church and have a word. So be ready for anything.
Yeah. I worked with one of the very first churches that I worked with, AJ. One of the gentlemen who was sitting on their strategic leadership team, we were going over their church ministry analysis, an assessment that we do. We were reviewing that, and he just didn't believe what we had in there. And the things that he disagreed with were just raw data. Like, we didn't make it up, attendance numbers and financial numbers and things like this, that we couldn't make them up if we wanted to. They just came straight from the church. And he didn't believe it. He said, these numbers are not true. And, talk about having to think on your feet. Like, how do you respond to someone just calling you a liar and making up data out of whole cloth? It was an interesting moment. So yes, you got to be prepared for the unexpected. All right, let's move on. Number 3.
Some fun anecdotes. Moving on to our next point. You've got to be consistent. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of aspects to, like, consistent in what? Well, you've got to be consistent in how you respond to people, how quickly you respond, how you this is really relationship management, right? Mm-hmm. This is staying consistent now in our case, we've got a process that we follow, and there's components that we work on. There's a particular scope of work. And so you've got to be consistent, not only in what's taught and what's worked through, but how you handle that client relationship, that church relationship, in scheduling meetings and showing up on time and driving them forward. You can't let up on pushing them towards success. And that's something that over the years, Scott, just we as a team have come to really embrace and value, and have even changed the way we handle our church partners that we work with, to drive them towards success.
I would even say it's something that differentiates the Malphurs Group from some other organizations, and I have no not trying to speak ill of anybody else or how they do things, but we meet every month remotely in the implementation phase, and lots of times these things are more like quarterly check-ins or things like that, and we have found that those don't work. You really got to stay on it every month, have a meeting, even if there's not much to report or much progress. That accountability of progress and process is really, really important. And I'll just full confession. So if I've got any past churches who are listening, you can vouch for this. In the past, I used to essentially put it on the shoulders of the church and go, hey, we offer this, almost like we offer the coaching. It's up to you to schedule the meeting with me. And that was a mistake. I've come to understand it has to be on me. I have to think we're not just offering this, it's part of our process, and it's like almost like a requirement. And so I have to make every effort to make sure that those meetings are happening every month. And if I don't, the results are obvious and apparent. You've probably heard me say this on the podcast before, listener, but the churches that keep working will succeed. The churches that the churches that keep meeting keep working. The churches that stop meeting stop working. That's true within the church. It's true in terms of the implementation review meetings with me, or with whoever your guide is. And so all that to say, AJ, that consistency, and you show up, you have to give everything you possibly can. And that's a key to success. If you don't, it's probably going to fall apart, or I guess I would say it won't be everything it could be. Most churches, we'll see, every church I've worked with has had some net benefit, which is like something I want to talk about in the next point. But the amount of that benefit or the extent of that benefit hinges on how consistent they are in the implementation. So you got to be willing to take ownership.
Yeah, I don't think, right. I mean, we always had the best of intentions in, being available for ongoing coaching support. It was never anything ill intended. No. But over the years, we've just learned that consistency just has to become part of the program. We want to help them build good habits in that. And one of the best habits is to continue meeting together, working through problems, working through implementation. And so us more so now sort of forcing facilitation of that has improved overall outcomes. And so I think that's a great change that we've made.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to be clear, like the difference is, it may seem like a distinction without a difference, but it's not. Before we would say, hey, here's my calendar, schedule a meeting with me, and kind of put it on them. And then if they didn't, we'd be like, well, I guess they didn't want to. Now it's just more consistent and going, hey, we need to get this meeting scheduled. When are we meeting? Being more forward about that and being more aggressive, I guess, and making sure that something gets scheduled, or making sure that they pick a regular time. Obviously, that's been the churches that do the best is if it's at the same time every month. They're more likely to show up versus having to pick a new time every month. That usually falls apart very quickly. So
right. Even that little piece right there demonstrates change. Like, we've made this a priority. It's a consistent thing that we're going to do. And so that in and of itself reveals we have changed our priorities and what we want to get done. And that's demonstrated by, we're going to do the same thing every month at pretty much the same date and time, because we care that much about it. So yeah, it's an indicator. So, and again, as a consultant, you've got to be able to detect these types of indicators so that you can try to steer them back into the right direction.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that was a really good one. Now, our next point though,
it's the other side of the coin.
Sounds contradictory, but it's not. And that is, you cannot do it for them. there's only so far you can take a church as an outsider, as a temporarily hired consultant to work through a set of problems. In the end, it's their church. It's their success or failure that that they have to live with, and you just can't do it all for them. What you can do is teach them good habits. You can set them on a road, a really great path, in a process, and in a way of working through things, and even a new philosophy of thinking through things. But in the end, it's like parenting. You've got to let them go at some point and trust that they're ready to work on their own. And in some cases, worst case scenarios is that they just don't have the leadership, the fortitude in leadership to continue to push through. And that's super unfortunate, but you never want that to be the case without you trying with everything you have.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, just yesterday, I was doing an implementation meeting with a church, and I don't want to get into the weeds too much, but essentially, one of the things that they needed to do was to collect some data. That they were trying to decide between 2 or 3 different strategies to employ, and I just kind of put a pause on the meeting and said, really, we can't make a good decision here because we don't have enough of the data that we need in order to make a good decision. I said, so let's spend a little bit of time going back and finding some of this information. Now, that was good advice. I stand firm by the advice because it would have just been like a shotgun approach. Just, let's just get a scatter shot and see what happens. But, which is not really ever a good strategy. At the end of the day, though, I can't go collect that data for them because I don't have access to it. There's no way for me to do that for them because it's all internal. It's all internal data. So they have to do that work. There was also a resource that I wanted them to read because I thought it might be clarifying for them. I've read that resource, but I can't read it for them, AJ. They have to do that part themselves. And so there's only so much you can do. I did my part. I was there at the meeting. I gave good advice. What they do from there is on them. And that can be really disappointing. It can be really frustrating because you can feel like some of my greatest frustrations in this ministry, AJ, and I'm sure it has been for you, is when you get the sense that that a church just doesn't want to put in what it's going to take.
Yeah,
they didn't think it through and go, okay, yeah, we're willing to do this. Or they said they were open-handed, but then when the rubber meets the road, they weren't ready to make a hard decision. Those things are disappointing.
It is.
Difficult.
Sure is. You know what? This just came to mind, Scott. Let me add in another sub point like we did earlier with a couple of things there. Okay. You can't do it for them. And sometimes they can't do it for themselves. And the important thing to remember is that there's a third party involved in this. And at the end of the day, this again is ministry, and the Holy Spirit plays a vital role in this. God is at the center, has to be at the center of this. And sometimes what ends up being beyond our abilities and their abilities is that space in which God works. And I know you've had these scenarios, Scott, and I certainly have, that, in the heat of something, trying to just work through something, and there's lots of things happening. Sometimes hitting that pause button for prayer is just where you need to go, because it could be that the answer isn't readily available to you or them in that moment. And you've got to be able to call on that sense that you just know we got to put a pin in this for a few minutes at least.
Yeah.
Call God back in a big way for us and guide us through this next phase that we're working on. And that could be something minutes long in the middle of a workshop session in which, maybe somebody dug something up from the past that there's different positions and hurts, and we need God to help us through that. Or maybe it's something a little bit longer term in which, we've got some tough decisions to make in the next 6 weeks, and let's just be prayerful about that. But I just wanted to interject that in
yeah.
here, that this is completely in the spiritual that we're working. There's nuts and bolts to things, and God's a strategic God, and he wants us to plan through how to execute well. But you've got to be a successful consultant, be able to call on the Holy Spirit through prayer at the appropriate times to answer the questions that are beyond human abilities in that moment.
Yeah, I would probably someone from this church is listening to this podcast right now. So sorry, but just this past week I was having a conversation with one church, and I just got the sense that they've had some tough challenges in the past, and that just have been really hard for them to move on from. And I just felt the need to say, I think that the church needs a night to gather together and to confess and to repent and to pray and sort of, in some sense, exercise this spirit of mistrust, distrust, fear, hurt. It's an evil spirit that's not from the Lord, and it's time to you got to let it go. You got to move on. You got to move forward. And so, you're right, AJ. Sometimes it's being able to read the room and going, there's an unclean spirit in this space that we've got to get rid of. And I'm not trying to get too Pentecostal or whatever, but I believe that stuff is real, right? And and we've got to be willing to call those things out.
Amen. There you go. Bonus. Moving on, our last point, you need to count the cost. So we'll give you a little bit of, a little peek behind the curtain.
Yeah, I mean, all these points have been about like qualifications and what the experience is like working with a church. But I think it'd be good to, this one's more nuts and boltsy on the individual side of like, what's the experience like for you, right?
Yeah. I mean, in most scenarios with, church consulting organizations in North America, very few people make it a full-time gig. It's usually a bivocational kind of thing. And so, there's travel. Church work happens on weekends. So there's time away from your family. There's
unless you're working with a navigation. I feel like we should put a qualification on that. Depends. If you happen to be working with a large church where all the work you're doing is with the staff, then it's probably during the week. But if you're working with a church in decline, which or a church that's plateaued, most revitalization stuff that we're doing, it's a lot of lay leaders, and so you got to do it on the weekend. So I just thought I would give that distinction.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So yeah, there's time involved with it. There's, churches, our audience know this very well. Church decision-making is not fast. So, there's lots of front end meetings and discussions and emails and things that happen. So it's a slow process to get started. And then, there's just things that you have to consider. So, I mean, what are your financial expectations? What are your travel expectations? What's your overall time expectation? All of these things are, everything in life is a trade. I mean, to trade this for that, whether that be time or money, you have to put the value for you personally into this. And, I think the major point that you wanted to make here, Scott, is simply remembering that this is ministry. Are you called to this ministry, or are you not called to this ministry? Because that will affect how you value the cost and what the reward is.
Totally. Yeah. I think that I just want to give some, again, we're peeling back the curtain here a little bit for you. We'd ever want to think about the process of partnering with a church as a sales process. It's not, because it's crass, and it's not how we think about what it is that we do. We think of it in terms of ministry and partnership. Mm-hmm. But in a real nuts and bolts kind of way, it is a lot like a sales process. There's a proposal to write and discussions to be had, and all good sales is relationship building. So that's true in the secular as well as in the consulting space. So it's best just to think of it through that lens anyway. But you do have to think of it in terms of a cycle. Like your initial conversation with the pastor or with an elder or with a board member or whomever your point of contact is. You have to think in a best case scenario, AJ. I think the fastest sort of from initial conversation to working with the church was a month. That would be extremely fast. Yeah. More likely it's 2 months or 3 months. So again, I just want to be really honest, especially since we're talking about trying to open up our certification process. You have to expect that it's going to take work on your part. If you're thinking that you're just going to be able to get certified and this flood of contacts are going to come your way and you're going to have to be turning people down, like you are fooling yourself. That is not how this works. And if you're a pastor, you know that that's true. You know how hard it is to get your church to agree to spend money on anything. And so you need, as a pastor, a partner, a consulting partner who's willing to do a little bit of legwork with you to help convince the church that we need a strategic envisioning process. We need a revitalization process. Very rarely, you don't have to convince the pastor about the value of the process, but that's not the only stakeholder that's necessary for getting started in a process like this. You often need to clear a board or some committee or a congregational vote. So I just want to say you've got to be willing to put in that legwork and risk that they may vote no, and you put in a month and a half of work trying to build a partnership with this church, and they vote no, and that's it, you know. Also, on a practical side, AJ, you think it's jet setting from coast to coast, and I have been from coast to coast within the last year, literally here in North America, and that's great. I love going to the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean and everywhere in between. But it's a lot of the insides of church classrooms and boardrooms and going to a hotel at 10 o'clock at night, or red-eye flights and long nights and delays and getting stuck in this airport overnight. And it's a lot of that. And so if the thought of that sounds awful to you, you should not do this. If you're not willing to put in the work, the relational work that it's going to take, the networking that it's going to take, the learning how to essentially sell something to a church, although, again, we don't like to think of it as sales. You still need to learn some of those skill sets. If you're not willing to do all that, you should just keep doing what you're doing. But if you can't think of doing anything else, which is how I feel, then we want to invite you to consider applying to be a part of our team. So, AJ, do you want to kind of get into that?
So our strategic envisioning guide certification is opening up. We'll be conducting some training this fall in October. And as of today, you can apply to become a TMG certified guide at malfersgroup.com/certification. So let me point out, this is an application. And so everybody will be reviewed by our leadership team and decide who's going to be the best candidates to do this. So it's limited. It's not just going to be open for any number of people and anybody that wants to. So we want to try to determine who's going to be the best fit for doing this work. And I hope that's you. I really do. So malfersgroup.com/certification. And we would love to hear from you about what your desires are for this ministry. And maybe you could be then talking about these kinds of things with churches and other consultants even in the future about the good, the bad, and the ugly of church consulting ministry.
I want to get into maybe just I don't want to make this just one long sales pitch for the certification process, because stand by, if you don't feel a call to this, you shouldn't do it. But just to hit on If you feel a call to consulting ministry, what would it look like to go through this process? So I just want to hit the high points, AJ. So once you go through the training process, so we'll have some legwork for you to do up front. That's kind of like homework for you to do. Then we have a 3-day training event. That's our training event is going to be on October 18th through the 20th. That is a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's a live training event, but it's done remotely. So you've got to show up, so to speak, but you don't have to travel anywhere to go. And after you've gone through that training process, you'll be added to a new guide showcase on our website that's going to be launching here this fall. There, people will be able to find a guide who lives near them in their area, or maybe has experience in their denominational background and these sorts of things. And people will be able to schedule directly with you to schedule a meeting and connect with you and find a guide that works for them. We'll also be able to steer some folks your way if we get a contact through a general form and you happen to be a good fit for them or in their area or that sort of thing. In terms of maintaining certification, AJ, we ask that you work with at least one church per year. If you don't, then there'll be a fee to recertify. But we're asking you, from our end, we're asking you to commit to work with one church per year in order to stay active. And there are incentives to working with more churches. As you work with more churches, you'll get a higher level of certification, and that will help you as people are looking for who to work with. People who are more experienced will, be more attractive, and so there's an incentive then to work hard on that. I'll also say on the back end, after certification, we don't abandon you. We have ongoing resourcing. We have a resource library that's continually updated. We'll host regular trainings for you to deal with hot button issues that might need to be addressed, or if we're seeing, our guides struggling in particular areas, we can hit on those things. And you'll be joining a community of like-minded folks who care about serving churches the same way you do, and that real sense of a team is valuable. So. Did I miss any of the high points, AJ? Did I hit all?
No, that's good. It sounds great. I would love to become a part of that, Scott. Sign me up.
All right. Well, if this sounds interesting to you, you can go to malfirsgroup.com/certification and get all the details. Find out what are the costs and times and things like that. If you just want to read the show notes for today, which are available right now, you can go to malfirsgroup.com/105 and read the article that corresponds with this, The Secrets of a Church Consultant, 5 Realities About Church Consulting. And that's it. So we thought that this might be helpful for you guys to see behind the curtain a little bit. What's it like to do the job that AJ and I do every day, and there are other members of our team do every day. And thought this would be fun to share.
Also out there on YouTube, Scott, they can view this episode, and there'll be a few discussion questions over there for your church around church consulting. So I hope you'll check that out as well. Thanks for being with us. We love you guys, and we'll be back next week.